Orange flames erupted from the yacht's engine room, painting Port Sterling's quiet harbour in hellish light as Carter Hayes gripped his fishing boat's wheel tighter. 30 seconds, maybe less, before that million-dollar vessel became a tomb. Salt spray and acrid smoke burned his throat as he navigated through floating debris, the yacht's elegant curves now twisted by fire and listing dangerously toward the icy Maine waters. Inside the flooding cabin, he found her unconscious. Silk blouse clinging to her skin, diamond earrings catching the emergency lights. Everything about her screaming wealth he'd never imagined. He dragged her limp body to his boat, radioed the Coast Guard, then watched paramedics load her onto a stretcher. But as reporters rushed toward the dock and cameras started flashing, Carter Hayes did something that would haunt them both for weeks. He melted back into the morning fog without giving his name, leaving behind only wet footprints and the mystery of a hero who saved a life, then vanished like smoke. The woman's eyes fluttered open 3 hours later in Portland General Hospital, confusion clouding her vision as white ceiling tiles came into focus. Alexandra Sterling, though she hadn't told anyone her real name yet, pressed her palm against the scratchy hospital gown, her throat raw from smoke inhalation. The nurse, with kind eyes and weathered hands, adjusted her IV drip, explaining how a mysterious fisherman had pulled her from certain death before disappearing without a trace. No name, no contact information, nothing but wet boot prints on the dock that had already dried in the morning sun. Alex touched the bandage on her forehead, remembering only fragments. Strong arms lifting her, calloused hands checking her pulse, the smell of engine oil mixed with salt water. The Coast Guard had found no identification on the rescuer, and by the time they'd thought to look for him, he'd vanished completely. Meanwhile, 30 miles north in Port Sterling, Carter Hayes sat at his kitchen table counting medical bills while his 8-year-old daughter Lucy colored at the other end. The morning's rescue felt like a dream now, something that had happened to someone else entirely. He'd changed out of his wet clothes, made Lucy breakfast, and driven her to school as if nothing had happened. But his hand still trembled slightly when he reached for his coffee mug. The local news was already calling it the mystery hero of Port Sterling. But Carter had turned off the television before Lucy could hear. She didn't need to know that her father had risked everything that morning, not when they were already walking such a thin line between survival and disaster. The stack of overdue notices seemed to mock him. Electric bill, car payment, and at the bottom, the estimate for Lucy's heart surgery that made his stomach clench with familiar dread. Lucy looked up from her drawing, her blonde curls catching the afternoon light streaming through their tiny kitchen window. She'd been sketching the same thing for days now, a man on a boat reaching toward what she called the Angel Lady. Carter had assumed it was just another one of her imaginative drawings, but now the image made his chest tighten with recognition. His daughter had witnessed the entire rescue from their trailer's small deck, though she'd been too far away to understand what was really happening. She thought it was beautiful, romantic even, like something from the fairy tales her mother used to read before cancer stole her voice forever. Carter reached across the table and smoothed down Lucy's hair, a gesture that had become automatic since becoming a single father 3 years ago. The first private investigator arrived in Port Sterling on a Tuesday, asking questions at Murphy's Diner about local fishermen and boat owners. Jake Morrison was thorough, methodical, and expensive, exactly what Alexandra Sterling needed to find the man who'd saved her life. She'd hired him from her hospital bed, still wearing borrowed clothes and a bandage across her temple, determined to properly thank her rescuer. The yacht had been a total loss, but that was just money. And Alex had more money than she knew what to do with. What she didn't have was peace of mind, not until she could look her hero in the eye and express her gratitude properly. Jake's investigation started with the obvious places, the 3 marinas within 10 miles of where the yacht had burned, interviewing dock masters and boat mechanics who might have noticed someone leaving early that morning. Carter had been expecting this, dreading it with the same sick feeling he got when opening bills he couldn't pay. He'd watched the news coverage, seen the rewards being offered, and known it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots. When Jake Morrison walked into Peterson's marina, where Carter worked part-time fixing engines, he felt his chest tighten with panic. But Jake was looking for someone with a newer boat, someone who might have been out early for leisure rather than necessity. Carter's 20-year-old fishing boat with the patched hull and temperamental engine didn't fit the profile of a good Samaritan with time to play hero. He kept his head down, continued working on the outboard motor in front of him, and answered Jake's questions with careful truth. Yes, he'd heard about the rescue. No, he hadn't seen anything unusual that morning. Alex began her own search 2 weeks later, frustrated by Jake's lack of progress and driven by a restlessness she couldn't explain. She'd never been the type to sit still while others solved her problems, and this felt too important to delegate entirely. Taking a leave of absence from Sterling Industries, something that sent shockwaves through the corporate world, she drove to Maine herself, checking into a small bed and breakfast in Camden under an assumed name. She told the proprietor she was a writer researching coastal communities, which wasn't entirely a lie. She was researching something, even if it wasn't for a book. The owner, a chatty woman named Beth, was happy to share local gossip about the mysterious rescue that had put their quiet stretch of coast on the national news map. The second marina proved more promising than the first. Captain Pete's harbor was smaller, grittier, filled with working boats rather than pleasure craft. Alex spent 3 days there, buying coffee for fishermen and dock workers, learning about tides and weather patterns, listening to stories about the sea that claimed as many lives as it supported. She was beginning to understand why someone might not want recognition for a rescue. These were private people who valued actions over words, substance over flash. An older fisherman named Walt told her about the unwritten code of the water. You help because it's right, not because you want anything in return. Real heroes don't stick around for the cameras, he said, spitting tobacco juice into the harbor. They just do what needs doing and go home to their families. By the third marina, Alex had changed. 3 weeks of simple living had stripped away the corporate armor she'd worn for so long, replacing designer suits with practical jeans and learning to appreciate the rhythm of small-town life. Port Sterling was different from the other harbors, smaller, more insular, with the kind of community bonds that formed over generations rather than business deals. She rented a room above Murphy's diner and settled in for what she suspected might be a longer stay. The harbor master, an ancient man named Gus, who seemed to know everyone's business, was polite but guarded. He'd heard about the lady looking for the mystery hero, and while he sympathized with her gratitude, he also understood why a local man might not want that kind of attention. Lucy found Alex at the library on a Thursday afternoon, drawn by the stranger who was reading in the children's section, despite clearly being an adult. Alex had been researching local maritime rescue protocols, but she'd gotten distracted by Lucy's artwork spread across a nearby table. The little girl was working on another version of her boat rescue drawing, this one more detailed than the others. Alex's breath caught as she recognized elements from her own rescue, the angle of the sinking yacht, the smoke pattern, details that could only have come from someone who'd witnessed the event firsthand. When Lucy looked up with curious blue eyes and asked if Alex liked her drawing, the connection felt electric. This child had seen her rescue, which meant her father might be exactly who Alex was looking for. "My daddy saves people," Lucy said with matter-of-fact pride, holding up her latest drawing. "He saved the angel lady from the burning boat." Alex's heart hammered against her ribs as she studied the child's artwork with new eyes. The proportions were childish, but the basic elements were all there. A small fishing boat approaching a larger vessel, smoke rising in dark clouds, a figure being pulled to safety. Lucy chattered on about how her daddy fixed boats and how he'd told her never to talk to strangers about that morning. But she was only 8, and Alex wasn't really a stranger anymore, since they'd been sitting together for 20 minutes. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity, and Alex felt closer to answers than she'd been since waking up in that hospital bed. The confrontation came sooner than Carter had hoped. He'd been working late at the marina, trying to finish an engine rebuild before the owner needed his boat for the weekend fishing tournament. The garage was dimly lit, filled with the familiar smells of motor oil and salt air, when Alex Sterling walked through the open bay door. Carter recognized her immediately, not just from the rescue, but from the newspaper photos that had run with the story. She looked different, though, softer somehow, wearing jeans instead of the business suits from the media coverage. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension stretched between them like a taut fishing line, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Carter's hands stilled on the wrench he'd been using, and Alex took a careful step forward. "You saved my life," Alex said simply, her voice carrying none of the commanding authority Carter had expected from a billionaire CEO. He didn't deny it, couldn't see the point when Lucy's drawings had already given him away. Instead, he set down his tools and faced her properly, noting how the harsh fluorescent lights made her look younger, more vulnerable than the polished executive he'd pulled from that burning cabin. She was studying his hands, the same calloused hands that had dragged her to safety, and he resisted the urge to wipe them clean on his work shirt. The silence stretched between them, filled with everything they weren't saying. Carter had rehearsed this moment in his head dozens of times, but now that it was happening, words felt inadequate. "Why did you leave?" Alex asked, and Carter heard genuine confusion in her voice rather than accusation. He glanced toward the marina office, where Gus was probably pretending not to watch through the window, then back at the woman whose life he'd saved and whose world threatened to destroy his own carefully constructed peace. The honest answer was too complicated, too wrapped up in his fears about Lucy and their fragile stability. How could he explain that heroes in small towns became legends, and legends attracted attention he couldn't afford? That reporters would dig into his background, find out about the medical bills and the custody concerns that kept him awake at night? That he'd rather remain invisible than risk losing the only thing that mattered, his daughter's well-being. "I don't need recognition," Carter said finally, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. "People do what they have to do. That's all it was." But Alex was shaking her head before he finished speaking, stepping closer with the kind of determination that had probably built her business empire. She'd spent 3 weeks learning about the unwritten codes of coastal communities, but she'd also spent 3 weeks thinking about the man who'd risked his life for a stranger. Recognition wasn't what she was offering. It was connection, gratitude, the simple human need to close a circle that had been left incomplete. Carter could see it in her eyes, the same restless energy that had driven her to find him in the first place. And he realized this wasn't going to be as simple as refusing her thanks and sending her back to her world. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of running footsteps on the wooden dock. Lucy burst through the garage door, her school backpack bouncing against her small frame, and her cheeks flushed from running. She stopped short when she saw Alex, recognition dawning on her face as she connected the real woman with the angel lady from her drawings. For a moment, the three of them formed an unlikely tableau: the reluctant hero, the grateful billionaire, and the child who'd witnessed it all from a distance. Lucy looked between her father and Alex with the kind of intuitive understanding that children sometimes possessed, sensing the weight of unspoken things in the air around them. Then she did what 8-year-olds do best. She cut straight through the adult complications with simple truth. "Daddy, you didn't tell her about my heart, did you?" Lucy asked, and Carter felt the blood drain from his face. Alex's expression shifted from confusion to concern as she looked between father and daughter, beginning to understand why Carter might have more pressing concerns than accepting gratitude from wealthy strangers. Lucy continued with the innocent directness of childhood, explaining about her upcoming surgery and how the doctors said it would make her heart strong like other kids. She didn't understand the financial implications, didn't know that Carter lay awake calculating costs and wondering if their insurance would cover enough. All she knew was that her daddy worried a lot lately, and maybe the nice lady who looked like an angel might be able to help somehow. The medical emergency struck with cruel timing. Lucy had been fine during their conversation, animated and cheerful as she described her latest drawing ideas to Alex. But stress had a way of manifesting in unexpected places, and the excitement of meeting her angel lady, combined with her father's obvious anxiety, triggered something that sent sharp pains through her small chest. Carter recognized the signs immediately. Lucy's hand pressed against her ribs, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid, the frightened look in her eyes that meant her heart was struggling with its rhythm. He swept her into his arms without hesitation, barking instructions at Alex to call 911 while he carried Lucy toward his truck. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was once again racing against time to save someone, but this time it was the person who mattered most in his world. At the hospital, Carter paced the hallway while doctors examined Lucy, his work boots squeaking against the polished linoleum with each turn. Alex had followed in her rental car, staying quietly in the background but refusing to leave, despite Carter's gruff suggestions that she should go back to her hotel. The emergency room physician was someone Carter knew. Dr. Patricia Mills had been Lucy's cardiologist since the heart murmur was first detected 3 years ago. She emerged from the examination room with the kind of expression that managed to be both reassuring and serious, explaining that Lucy was stable, but that the episode was a clear indicator that surgery could no longer be postponed. The timeline had just accelerated from within 6 months to within 6 weeks, and Carter felt the familiar weight of financial impossibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Alex watched Carter's face crumble as the doctor outlined the surgical timeline and costs. She'd spent enough time in corporate boardrooms to recognize when someone was drowning in numbers they couldn't control, and she understood now why her rescuer had walked away that morning. This wasn't about modesty or small-town values. It was about a father whose pride was battling his desperation, who would rather suffer in silence than accept help that might come with strings attached. When Dr. Mills mentioned the possibility of transferring Lucy to Boston Children's Hospital for the procedure, Alex saw Carter's hands clench into fists. The best care for his daughter was also the most expensive, and he was calculating whether their insurance would cover even half the costs. The mathematics of desperation were written clearly across his weathered features. "Let me help," Alex said quietly after the doctor had left them alone in the family consultation room. Carter's immediate response was to shake his head, to start listing all the reasons why he couldn't accept charity from someone whose world operated on completely different principles than his own. But Alex had learned something during her weeks in Port Sterling, something about the difference between charity and community, between obligation and genuine care. She wasn't offering to pay Lucy's medical bills because she felt guilty about being rescued. She was offering because in 3 weeks of searching for her hero, she'd discovered something she'd been missing her entire life. The authentic connections that money couldn't buy. The kind of relationships built on mutual respect rather than financial advantage. The negotiation took place over coffee in the hospital cafeteria, with Lucy sleeping peacefully upstairs and both adults carefully mapping the boundaries of what Carter could accept. Alex had to convince him that her offer came with no strings attached, no publicity, no expectation of future gratitude or access to his family. She wanted to pay for Lucy's surgery because she could, because she understood what it meant to lose someone you loved to circumstances beyond your control, and because sometimes the universe provided opportunities to balance the scales. Carter listened to her talk about her own childhood loneliness, about building a company that generated millions while leaving her emotionally bankrupt, about how saving his daughter felt like the first truly meaningful thing her money had ever accomplished. They reached an agreement that preserved Carter's dignity while ensuring Lucy received the best possible care. Alex would cover the medical expenses through an anonymous foundation structured as a community assistance grant rather than personal charity. Carter would continue working at the marina, continue raising Lucy in the same modest trailer, continue living the life he'd built from determination and love rather than inherited wealth. The only change would be Lucy's health, and the quiet knowledge that sometimes help came from unexpected directions. Alex didn't ask for gratitude or ongoing friendship. She simply asked for the chance to do something good with resources she'd never really needed. The transaction felt less like charity and more like the natural flow of a community taking care of its own. Lucy's surgery was scheduled for the following month at Boston Children's Hospital, giving them time to prepare mentally and emotionally for the procedure. During those weeks, Alex became a familiar presence in Port Sterling, not as the mysterious billionaire searching for her rescuer, but as someone who belonged to the community's fabric. She learned to tie proper fishing knots from Walt at Captain Pete's harbor, helped Beth at the bed and breakfast with her bookkeeping, and gradually earned the quiet acceptance that came only to those who proved their worth through actions rather than words. The townspeople had initially been suspicious of her wealth and background, but her genuine investment in their community gradually won them over. Carter found himself looking forward to Alex's presence in ways that surprised him. She had a knack for showing up when he needed an extra pair of hands at the marina, never interfering with his work, but somehow making the tasks feel less solitary. Lucy adored her, treating Alex like the aunt she'd never had, and sharing stories about her mother that Carter hadn't heard in years. Watching them together, Lucy chattering about school while Alex listened with genuine interest, stirred feelings in Carter that he'd buried since his wife's death. Not romantic feelings exactly, but something deeper. The recognition that his family didn't have to be complete with just two people, that love could expand to include unlikely additions without diminishing what came before. The morning of Lucy's surgery arrived with typical Maine weather, grey skies and intermittent drizzle that matched Carter's emotional state. He'd barely slept, spending most of the night sitting in Lucy's room watching her breathe and trying not to think about all the things that could go wrong. Alex had driven up to Boston the night before, respecting Carter's need for family time while ensuring she'd be available if needed. Lucy was nervous but brave, chattering to the nurses about her drawings and explaining how her daddy was the best boat fixer in all of Maine. Carter held her hand until the anesthesia took effect, then spent the longest 4 hours of his life pacing the surgical waiting room while skilled hands worked to repair his daughter's heart. De Rodriguez emerged from surgery with the kind of smile that meant everything had gone according to plan. Lucy's heart defect had been corrected successfully, and barring any complications, she should be able to live a completely normal life. Carter felt his knees buckle with relief, years of worry and fear draining out of him in a rush that left him dizzy. Alex appeared at his elbow with a cup of coffee and a quiet presence that somehow made the good news feel more real. They sat together in the recovery room, watching Lucy sleep off the anesthesia, her small chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of a properly functioning heart. For the first time in 3 years, Carter could imagine a future without the constant undercurrent of medical anxiety. Lucy's recovery progressed smoothly, aided by her natural resilience and the kind of optimism that only children possessed. She was fascinated by the monitors that tracked her heartbeat, proud of the small scar that she claimed made her look like a pirate, and eager to get back to Port Sterling where she could show everyone her drawings of the heart-fixing angels. Alex visited daily, bringing books and art supplies, learning to braid Lucy's hair, and listening to detailed explanations of 8-year-old social dynamics. Carter watched these interactions with growing wonder, seeing how naturally Alex had integrated herself into their small family unit, without ever overstepping boundaries or trying to replace what had been lost. The drive back to Port Sterling took place on a crisp October morning, when the maple trees had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. Lucy slept in the back seat for most of the journey, exhausted by the excitement of finally going home, while Carter and Alex talked quietly about practical things, follow-up appointments, activity restrictions, the gradual return to normal routines. But beneath the surface conversation lay deeper currents, unspoken acknowledgments of how fundamentally their relationship had changed over the past 2 months. They were no longer stranger and rescuer, or even benefactor and recipient. They had become something more complex and valuable, genuine friends bound together by shared experience and mutual respect. Back in Port Sterling, the community welcomed Lucy home with the kind of celebration that small towns did best. Murphy's Diner had strung up a banner reading, "Welcome home, Lucy," and half the harbour showed up to hear about her adventures in the big city hospital. Walt brought her a carved wooden boat that he'd been working on during her absence, and Beth presented her with a scrapbook documenting all the drawings Lucy had given her over the summer. Alex watched from the edge of the crowd, understanding that this was Lucy and Carter's moment. But Carter caught her eye and gestured her forward. She belonged here now, not as an outsider looking in, but as someone who had earned her place through commitment and care. The conversation about Alex's future plans happened gradually, over weeks of shared dinners and evening walks along the harbour. She'd been in Port Sterling for 3 months now, officially on extended leave, but practically building a life that had nothing to do with corporate boardrooms or profit margins. Sterling Industries was running smoothly without her daily involvement, managed by executives she'd trained and systems she'd put in place. The question wasn't whether the company needed her, but whether she needed it. The woman who had built a business empire was discovering that her greatest achievement might be learning to live a life measured by relationships rather than revenues. Carter found himself hoping Alex would stay, though he was careful not to pressure her with expectations she hadn't chosen for herself. Lucy was less subtle, regularly asking when Alex would move out of the bed and breakfast and into a real house where she could have proper art supplies and maybe a cat. The practical considerations were significant. Alex's wealth would always create certain complications in a community where most people lived paycheck to paycheck. But Port Sterling had a way of accepting people based on their contributions rather than their bank accounts, and Alex had proven her value through actions rather than words. The decision crystallized during Lucy's first follow-up appointment with Dr. Mills. Lucy's heart was functioning perfectly. Her activity restrictions had been lifted, and she was cleared to return to all normal childhood pursuits. As they left the medical complex, Lucy asked if this meant Alex would go back to her real life, now that the emergency was over. The question hung in the air between all 3 of them, highlighting the artificial timeline that had brought them together and the genuine bonds that had developed beyond the original crisis. Alex realized she'd been thinking about Port Sterling as her real life for weeks now, and Boston felt more like the temporary assignment. Alex made her choice on a morning when Lucy's laughter echoed across the harbour as she played with other children on the dock. The sound represented everything Alex had been missing without knowing it. Spontaneous joy, authentic community, the simple pleasure of belonging somewhere without having to prove her worth through achievements or acquisitions. She called her assistant in Boston and began the process of restructuring her life around what actually mattered. Sterling Industries would continue under new leadership, with Alex maintaining ownership but stepping back from daily operations. She would consult remotely when needed, but her primary residence would be a small house she'd found for sale 3 blocks from Carter and Lucy's trailer. Carter's response to Alex's decision was characteristically understated, but deeply felt. He helped her move into her new house, teaching her the quirks of small-town living, like which plumber actually showed up when called and where to buy the best lobster rolls. Lucy appointed herself as Alex's decorator and life coach, explaining the social hierarchies of 2nd grade and demonstrating proper techniques for skipping stones in the harbour. The 3 of them settled into routines that felt both new and timeless. Saturday morning breakfasts at Murphy's Diner, evening walks that often ended with ice cream, lazy Sunday afternoons when Lucy would draw while the adults talked about everything and nothing. Winter in Port Sterling tested Alex's commitment to her new life in ways that summer visitors never experienced. The tourist season ended abruptly after Labor Day, leaving the community to face the harsh realities of weather and isolation that defined coastal Maine life. Alex discovered muscles she'd never used while splitting firewood, learned to drive on icy roads without panicking, and found unexpected satisfaction in the simple rhythm of small-town winter survival. Carter taught her practical skills like winterizing pipes and banking fires that would burn through the night, while Lucy showed her how to build snow angels and catch snowflakes on her tongue. The first Christmas was particularly meaningful, marking not just the holiday season, but the completion of Lucy's recovery and the full integration of Alex into their unconventional family unit. They decorated a tree in Alex's living room, with Lucy providing artistic direction, and both adults following her sometimes chaotic but always enthusiastic instructions. Carter contributed ornaments he'd carved from driftwood, while Alex added delicate glass decorations that had belonged to her grandmother, the only sentimental items she'd kept from her previous life. The tree represented a perfect blend of their different backgrounds and shared future, beautiful in its imperfection and rich with meaning that money couldn't buy. Lucy's Christmas list that year included items that revealed how completely Alex had become part of her world. Along with typical 8-year-old requests for art supplies and books, she asked Santa to help Alex learn how to braid her hair better and to make sure Carter smiled more often. She wanted a new easel for her room and permission to paint a mural on the wall that would show the story of how her daddy saved an angel and the angel saved them back. The innocence of her perspective cut through all the adult complications of wealth and social differences, reducing their relationship to its essential truth. They were a family now, bound together by choice and commitment rather than blood or law. The spring brought new beginnings, and the kind of renewal that only came after surviving a Maine winter together. Lucy's latest drawings showed 3 figures standing together on a dock, no longer depicting dramatic rescues but quiet moments of daily happiness. Carter had been promoted to marina manager, a position that came with better pay and the respect of the entire fishing community. Alex had established a small foundation that provided education grants to local children, funded from her personal wealth but administered by community volunteers who understood local needs better than any outside organization ever could. The conversation about marriage happened gradually, embedded in discussions about practical matters like Lucy's school enrollment and summer vacation plans. Neither Carter nor Alex felt the need for dramatic declarations or public ceremonies. Their commitment had been proven through months of shared challenges and quiet support. They were already a family in every way that mattered, and the legal formalities seemed less important than the daily choice to build a life together. When they finally did exchange vows, it was in a simple ceremony on the dock where Carter's boat was moored, with Lucy as their witness and the entire Port Sterling community as their celebration. The ending came not with dramatic crescendos, but with the quiet satisfaction of lives lived authentically. 5 years after that morning when orange flames painted the harbor in hellish light, Carter and Alex stood together watching Lucy, now 13 and taller than her stepmother, teach a group of younger children how to tie sailing knots. The girl who had once needed surgery to fix her heart was now the harbor's unofficial junior sailing instructor, patient and encouraging with the smaller kids who struggled to master the complex techniques. Her latest artwork hung in Alex's foundation office, depicting not rescues or angels but ordinary moments made extraordinary by love and commitment. Carter's hands were still calloused from working on boat engines, though he now owned the marina rather than just fixing motors for other people. Alex wore jeans more often than business suits, her corporate wardrobe relegated to the few times per year when Sterling Industries business required her personal attention. Lucy's room was filled with ribbons from art contests and sailing competitions, testament to talents that had flourished in the security of a stable, loving home. They had become exactly what they'd never known they wanted, an ordinary family, whose greatest achievement was the extraordinary depth of their commitment to each other. The mystery that had brought them together was no longer mysterious, but it remained meaningful in ways that transcended the original crisis. Carter had learned that accepting help didn't diminish his worth as a father or a man, while Alex had discovered that true wealth lay in relationships that couldn't be quantified or traded. Lucy had grown up understanding that families came in many forms, that love could expand to include unexpected additions, and that the most important heroic acts were often the smallest daily kindnesses. They had all been rescued that morning when the yacht burned, though it had taken years to understand exactly what they'd been saved from and what they'd been saved for. The final image was of Carter teaching Lucy's younger half-brother, Alex's son, born 3 years into their marriage, how to handle a fishing rod, while Alex watched from the dock with the kind of contentment that came only from a life lived in alignment with one's deepest values. The little boy was too young to understand the story of how his family had been formed, but he would grow up knowing that heroes came in many forms and that the best rescues were often mutual. Port Sterling Harbor reflected the morning sun like scattered diamonds, peaceful and eternal, holding their small boat steady as Carter guided small hands toward the adventure of catching their very first fish.